So, Dr. Thomas Verny, welcome to Shrink Rep Radio.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we're going to be focusing on your book, The Embodied Mind. But first, give us a sense of your background. How did you come to this point in your life and your career?
Well, how far back do you want me to go? Essentially, I guess, it started when I was in Vienna. I was born in Bratislava, which at that time was Czechoslovakia. And in 1949, my parents and I, we sort of escaped from, which at that time became communist Czechoslovakia. We escaped to Vienna. And I did not speak any German. And the apartment that we rented had some bookshelves and some books on it. And one of the books was by Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams. And I was 13 years old, and somehow, I cannot explain it how, but somehow I knew that Freud was important. Like, this is something I should read. Nobody told me that, like it was just in me somehow. And so with a dictionary in my hand, a Czech and German dictionary, I started reading The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud. And I just loved it. I just loved the way, his mind was working. I love this kind of digging deeper and deeper, going sort of deeper into the very core of someone's belief or dream or whatever it was. I just love the process. And so then and there, I made up my mind that I would become a psychiatrist. So then we emigrated to Canada in 1952. And I was fortunate enough to get into medical school here at the University of Toronto. And very quickly, I got the impression from the professors that we had in medicine, who at that time, like this was the late 1950s, were still people who had served during the Second World War in the army. And they were kind of hard-nosed, very realistic, I would say fairly unimaginative, non-philosophical, not particularly empathic or sensitive people. And the impression or the message that I got from these professors was that psychiatrists were just a bunch of sort of idiots who were treating very rich ladies who had no other problems than where to find a good veterinarian for their little dog. So I did not want to spend my life, treating rich ladies who had, essentially no problems. And so then I decided to become an obstetrician. But during my last year, it's a 6-year course here in Canada. So during my last year, before graduating, I decided to go and work during the summer in a psychiatric hospital in the United States. Now, at that time, psychiatric hospitals were huge. They're not that big nowadays anymore. But this was like a hospital in Upper New York State, 5,000 patients.
Wow.
And about 36 doctors. And
wow.
and I would say out of the 36, perhaps 30 were foreign doctors, mostly from the Philippines, who would sort of visit the patients in the morning, and then they would spend the afternoon studying for their exams to become qualified in the United States. So here I was, young and keen, and so the director said, "Where would you like to work? Which department?" And I said I would like to work in the emergency where people first came in. And
Mm-hmm.
so he said, fine. So at that time, I had like very, very little knowledge of psychiatry. All I knew was, to make diagnosis and to take a history.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty well all I knew. And we hardly had any real drugs at that time to treat psychiatric patients. So, I mean, it was just beginning to have Largactil, which is like a major antipsychotic.
Mm-hmm.
But that was just about the only drug, and the rest were Ritalin and, really old drugs and electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. So I started working in the emergency ward, and because I knew that you had to take a history, I would have a tiny office, half of the size of this room, and I would ask the patients to come in, sit down, and then I would start talking to them about, what led up to their hospitalizations, things like that. And then I would give them another appointment the next day to continue talking. Well, within about 3 days, the word got around that there was actually a psychiatrist here. They called me a psychiatrist. I was only a medical student. There was a psychiatrist here who actually talked to people. And so within a few days, there would be these huge lineups in front of my office of patients wanting to talk to me. And I discovered very quickly that my patients got better and discharged much faster than the other patients whose psychiatrist essentially just took a quick history and then just filled them up with drugs and never saw them again. So then I very quickly realized that psychiatrists actually did some good with really, really sick patients.
Mm-hmm.
So then I went back to becoming a psychiatrist. And so when I became a psychiatrist, I would see patients, of course. And one day I saw a patient with whom I was discussing his dream, because I was really still keen on dreams. And while discussing this dream, my patient started crying like a little baby. And he did that for about 10 minutes. And then he came out of it. And I asked him what had happened. And he said that he had just found himself in a baby crib. And he was a baby and he was crying for his mother. And then he said, being a somewhat skeptical young lawyer, actually, then he said, there's something wrong with this experience that I just had, because I just found myself in a white crib. And I've actually seen pictures, baby pictures of myself, and they were in a blue crib. So I said, well, go home, talk to your mother, see if she can bring some light to this. And he came back next week and he said, this is really amazing. But it seems that the first 3 months of my life, I spent in a white crib, which was borrowed from a neighbor. And only when I was 3 months old did my parents buy a blue crib for me. And that's the one in which all the pictures were taken. So this man had absolutely no idea that he ever spent time in a white crib. So that gave me pause to think. And because this is sort of my nature, when something like this comes up, I don't just sort of forget about it, but it sort of started me thinking, how is this possible? How could a person at the age of 1 month or 2 months or 3 months remember anything that happened to him? Because I was taught at school, and I went to some really good schools, including Harvard, that children before the age of 2 don't remember anything. So how is this possible? And so, I started looking around and I started asking people about their early experiences, and lots of stories started coming my way. And so as that happened, I began to question whether sort of the accepted wisdom of the age, the wisdom that was being taught in schools, that children before the age of 2 don't remember anything, whether that was wrong. And so what happened next was that I met an obstetrician and I told him about these experiences. He was very skeptical, but he said, you know, there is a big international meeting in Rome in a couple of months. Every 4 years, it's an international meeting of psychosomatic obstetrics and medicine. Why don't you present a paper there? So I was very young. I was totally unknown, but I sent in a proposal for a paper, and it was called The Psychic Life of the Unborn Child. And lo and behold, it was accepted. It was accepted.
Had you written it? Had you written it at that point?
At this point, I just wrote a sort of a summary of some of my thoughts on the psychic life of the unborn child. And so the paper was accepted. I was given, I think, half an hour. But not only was it accepted, and this is where, you know, good luck really plays a very important role in one's life. Like, you know, you can be smart, you can work hard, but you also need luck.
Yes.
And the good luck was that I was put on the main speaker's platform on Friday morning or something like that. Are you familiar with R.D. Laing by any chance?
Yes, yes, I am.
Okay, so Ronnie Laing was on the same morning as I was, preceding me. So like everybody who counted was there, okay? And so I gave my half-hour paper on the psychic life of the unborn child. And within about 20 minutes, you know, I noticed that the audience was really excited. Like people were really, really listening. And so I said at the end of my talk, I said, if you would like to pursue this subject further, come and see me at 5 o'clock at the end of the lectures at room 449, whatever it was. And so at 5 o'clock, once again, there was this big lineup of people in front of my room wanting to talk to me, including Ronnie Laing. And Ronnie and I became, you know, fairly close. I wouldn't say friends, but good acquaintances. And so he was there, and many other of the leading lights in psychosomatic obstetrics. And so once I noticed that and observed it, I thought to myself, well, I should really write a book on this. And so that led me to write The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. It was first called, when I submitted it for publication, it was called The Psychic Life of the Unborn Child. But the publishers thought that that sounded too much off the wall, kind of California, you know, new age. So let's call it The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. So when that book came out, of course, it like totally changed my life, because it was at a time, it was published by Simon & Schuster, and it was at a time when actually publishers had money. Nowadays, they all complain of not having money. The only money they have, you know, is perhaps for Prince Harry when he writes a book. But, you know, by and large, for your average author. And so anyway, they paid for a big publicity campaign. I went from coast to coast on radio and television and newspaper interviews. And so the book became a huge bestseller. It's now published in 27 countries, and it's still selling. It's still selling. So that's how I became then very interested in sort of life before birth.
Right.
And life before birth, and giving the unborn child, certainly from the 6 months after conception, credibility in terms of intelligence, in terms of cognition, in terms of being able to remember things that happen during the last trimester. And having said that, just to come to a conclusion before everybody falls asleep, to come to a conclusion, so I became very interested in consciousness before birth and memory.
Yeah.
And so I followed that up. But one of the things that always bothered, and then I followed it up with several other books on similar subjects. But what always bothered me was the fact that I also had reports from patients or just non-patients, people all over the world, of memories going back further, going back right to conception. And so I was wondering, how is that possible? How is it, I mean, if these reports are credible, and I was able to ascertain them that they were credible, being supported by other people and documents and things like that. If that really happens, how does it happen biologically, physiologically? Okay, because as interesting as case reports are, which my critics call anecdotes.
Yes.
I'm
familiar with that from the world of animals as well.
Right,
that you
right.
see, if you haven't sort of got the animal in a scientific institute,
Yes,
and
it's anecdotal.
Exactly.
We can discount it.
Which is crazy, because as soon as you have it in a scientific institute, everything is artificial.
Absolutely, exactly. So it even less credible in a sense. But anyway, so I was wondering about how that could, how that happens. And about 7 years ago, well, I guess it's about 8 years now. About 8 years ago, I came across, in one of these medical journals that I read, I came across the story of a 44-year-old Frenchman who went to see his doctor because of a weakness in his left leg. And so they did all kinds of lab studies, including x-rays of his head. And to everyone's surprise, they found that this man had just a thin crust of brain tissue in his skull, and the rest of his skull was full of water, cerebrospinal fluid. And the medical condition is called hydrocephalus, yes. Water on the brain, hydrocephalus. Now, this man was 44 years old. He was a married man, 2 children, and gainfully employed in the French civil service. And I thought to myself, how is this possible? How can a man with 90% of his brain missing live normally? There must be somewhere else in the body some kind of a backup system to explain this, because there's no way. I mean, your computer could not function on 10% capacity. How can a person? So that's when I started, once again, looking into research and seeing that actually there were a lot of reports in the literature of children who, for example, had half of their brain or 3/4 of the brain removed because they were having epileptic attacks, which just continued and continued and continued, seizures. And the doctors could not stop them. And the only way they could stop them was to take part or a great part of their brains out. And the same with adults. And many of these people, not all of them, but many of these people continued to live normal lives. So when I saw that, the idea came to me that there has to be, just like your computer has got a backup system. So if anything goes wrong with the computer, you can go to the cloud or whatever other backup system you have. that our brains must have a bodily backup system below the neck, so to speak. And so I started looking into how cells are made and how tissues in the body function, and the intricate sort of network, sort of the ways cells communicate with each other, communicate with the brain, all this kind of stuff. Took me about 7 years to do that, and a lot of work, a lot of
Yes.
incredible amount of work. I read approximately 5,000 books and journals to gain, a solid understanding of what's going on, including genetics, epigenetics, how information is passed from parental genes to the children's genes, all that kind of stuff.
Well,
And
I was thinking about that just today, Thomas, because
yes,
when I was listening to, I mentioned before we started recording, I've been listening to David George Haskell's book, Songs
yes,
of Trees, and he mentioned in that book that trees can pass on epigenetically the
through
memory of the
through their
weather
roots.
conditions. No, this is
Oh,
through their seeds. So
oh,
so they can pass on through, if they've gone through a severe drought, they can pass on the memory of that drought to the seedling that grows from the seeds that are created that year.
amazing. Well,
Yeah.
I think it's amazing, but of course, I totally believe it. And so, we talk nowadays about the transgenerational transmission of trauma, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very important, especially in these traumatic times, I mean, those poor kids in Ukraine and many other places in the world where there are warlike conditions. I mean, those children are inheriting a lot of trauma.
Mm.
And this is going to be reflected in the way they develop, both physically and emotionally. So, just to put sort of an end to this, to this little lifelong quest that I've been on, I came to the conclusion that yes, our cells are intelligent in their own way, and when they work together as a system, they are very intelligent. And so I think that we have to realize that the brain is in constant communication with the rest of the body. The brain does not work alone. And so it's very important to realize that we have to really, and this is so important, we can talk about this later. This is so important for medicine. It's so important for pharmaceutical companies to realize that when you are looking for answers to, for example, Alzheimer's disease, degenerative brain disease, things like that, all of them are focusing on the brain instead of focusing on the whole body.
Yeah.
So what I'm suggesting is, I'm not saying that the brain is not important. What I'm suggesting is that the brain and the body are both important, and that we need to have a much more holistic understanding of health and disease.
Yes, I wanted to commend you on your book, because what you've said, 5,000 books and papers, the depth of research and knowledge and information in there is absolutely astonishing. But even more astonishing is how readable it is, and how you've managed to communicate so many very complex ideas in a way that a layperson like myself can understand them. That in itself, I think, is a phenomenal achievement, and for that reason, I'd heartily recommend the book. Just so much research, and presented in a way that that you can as a layperson follow it, and feel very persuaded by it. I mean, there's so much research there that one would almost be sort of foolish not to take it seriously. And
Thank you. Thank you.
and to sort of my my very layperson understanding, sort of in a nutshell, you seem to highlight that contrary to commonly accepted understanding, from cells to brains, and I'm just recapitulating what you said,
yes,
from
that's fine.
cells to brains, nothing is autonomous. And also there is not just a communication upwards and downwards through every level, but also intelligence critically at every level, and memory at every level of the system. And so we're seeing, you know, the human body as something much more akin to a complex ecosystem. And certainly, and I think you draw upon this, that systems theory is a much more appropriate way to looking at the body than a kind of you know, logical A equals B equals C sort of causal approach to understanding.
Yes, and as you have indicated, the important thing is to realize that everything is connected.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is connected. So, you know, just like the brain is connected to the heart is connected to the gastrointestinal system, the liver is connected to the brain. I mean, everything is connected. We are connected to each other. We are connected to our external environment and everything else, you know, like there are no really limits. And to you know, it seems that one of the problems is that materialism and determinism, you know, are sciences tweedledum and tweedledoo. And the embodied mind, my book, The Embodied Mind, challenges the prevailing concept of reductionism,
Mm-hmm.
and emphasizes the need for more holistic and spiritual approach to understanding the humanity of humans. So it goes beyond materialism. And, you know, I think that there is a very good chapter on the quantum mind in my book.
Yes,
explaining sort of quantum mechanics, I hope, and most people have agreed with me, in a way that even the uninitiated can understand.
Yes, I did take out a quote from that section where you wrote, "The mind complements matter, just as the particle aspect of matter complements its wave aspect. Consciousness can interface with the material world because matter and energy are interchangeable." And that way of putting it did strike me as, you know, as having a beautiful clarity. There's a kind of Occam's razor-esque feel to the to that making sense. It seems the most parsimonious way of looking at the hard problem.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yes, the hard problem, right. Yeah, so, you know, that kind of writing takes a long time. Like, you know, I might spend a couple of hours on a sentence just to make sure that it really, you know, is clear and makes sense and is scientifically supported, which is why sometimes I'm very critical of other writers who don't take that kind of time and patience to write their stuff. And, you know, I come across sentences that are all mixed up and I say, how did this ever get through an editor?
We briefly mentioned the role of quantum mechanics there, and I'm sure it will you know, it will be sort of hanging there in the minds of the listeners and the viewers to say, well, what do you mean about that, Dr. Verny? So so although you do a very wonderful job of offering a précis in the book, can you précis it even more shortly here?
What is your question?
The role of quantum mechanics in understanding the embodied mind.
Well, you know, there are many sort of teachings or theories of quantum mechanics which can be applied to the mind. And one of the most important and one of the first experiments actually which started the whole interest in quantum mechanics was the fact that when an experiment was observed, it turned out differently than when it was not observed. So since that time, it has become like one of the basic tenets of quantum mechanics that an observer makes a difference to the outcome. And so I say the same thing happens to us humans when you begin to observe what is going on in your body, when you begin to become aware of some of your, let's say, unconscious ideas, which very often are really negative and destructive. You know, some idea that you're not good enough, you're not as good as your father or your brother, or things like that, which are deeply ingrained in our unconscious. When you become more aware of these kinds of toxic scripts that most of us, I would say 99% of the population, carry around with us somewhere, somehow, as you become aware of it, you can change it, because you become the observer of your own unobserved tendencies or scripts, or whatever you want to call it. So it will make a big, big difference. And the same thing sort of is, if I may just mention that, in terms of epigenetics, because epigenetics teaches us that the external environment, which includes us, the external environment changes how our genes act. In other words, the gene itself does not get changed, but whether it is activated or deactivated makes a difference. So you may have a gene for schizophrenia, for example, but you will never get schizophrenia if that gene is turned off. And it's turned off by these little switches, which are called methyl and ethyl groups. And that is done by the environment. So if you live, for example, a healthy life, both physically and psychologically, that gene may not get turned on. And so you'll never get schizophrenia or cancer or any of those negative genes that you may have. Whereas before epigenetics, and I'll go back to quantum mechanics in a second, before epigenetics, people were taught that genes are your destiny. And so again, you know, that's one of the chapters in my book, which shows you that genes are not your destiny. They are not your destiny. It's a blueprint, yes, but you are the architect. And if the blueprint, I don't know, you know, calls for a wall here, and you decide that you don't want to build that wall, you don't have to. So going back to quantum mechanics. So the other thing about quantum mechanics is, and this, you know, drove scientists totally up the wall when it was first talked about and discovered, was that you cannot tell with certainty where any one particle, like a proton, neutron, whatever, any one of those subatomic particles is located. You can only approximate where it is located. So we have this whole idea of uncertainty, whereas in the past, materialism, determinism, as I was saying, it was all certain, right? So like Newton's laws of movement and mass and all those things, it was all precise, mathematically predictable. In quantum mechanics, things are only statistically probable, but not predictable. And so that allows, again, for a much more open way of looking at the mind, that things are not written in stone, that there is possibility of change, possibility of unpredictability, which is good. I mean, you know, who wants to live a life which is totally predictable, right? That would be terribly boring and terribly awful. So, you know, that's another thing. And the third thing is what's called a superposition. When a particle that was at one time one, like one unit, becomes divided. And so you have, let's say, one proton 1,000 miles away from the first one. Let's say proton A is 1,000 miles away from proton B, but they are still in some way connected, which we do not understand.
And is that you have a section on sympathetic communication, which I was
Yes,
very interested in.
exactly. Exactly.
Yes, and so the idea is that that perhaps in those situations where we can't fully explain how someone seems to be experiencing something when they aren't there, that
Right.
that this might be a way of moving onwards in our understanding. Is that correct?
That is correct. So, in other words, nobody understands this, but the fact is that if this proton A is moved in a certain way instantly, which goes totally against the laws of Einstein and all the other scientists who, contributed hugely to science. Einstein says that the fastest way that anything can be communicated is the speed of light. Speed of light is sort of the ultimate limit. Yeah, nothing can move faster than the speed of light.
Yes, didn't he dismiss spooky action at a distance? Isn't that the term?
Beautiful, beautiful. That's the term, spooky action at a distance, right? And God does not play
dice. It doesn't play dice.
Right. He came out with some pretty good sayings.
Yeah.
He did. But he was no friend of quantum mechanics because it sort of totally went against his own discoveries, which is understandable. But the point is, as you have rightly mentioned, that these two subatomic particles are somehow connected, because the moment that one is made to spin in a certain way, the other one will spin in the opposite way. So how does that happen? Nobody knows. All we know at the moment is that somehow they are connected. And what I propose is that people who are in a very close relationship, who somehow, are brothers, sisters, or are very good friends, are also connected. And so when one of them goes through a very drastic change in their status, let's say that they're in a car accident, the other one will suddenly know that something has happened to his brother or mother or father or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does this happen? I don't know, but it happens along the same ways. This is sort of another way in which quantum mechanics can teach us about human behavior and, human actions. So all of that I find very interesting, and I don't think that we have, said the last word on this, but what I like to think is that it opens up the gates for more research and more advances in understanding humans.
How do you think that this kind of understanding could particularly help in your area of medicine and psychiatry? One thing I was thinking, and it's not related to the quantum mechanics, but something that struck me very strongly in your writing was the idea of body armor.
Yes.
And this is related to, I think, some of Bessel van der Kolk's work. He's been a guest on Shrink Wrap Radio. I know.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Dave has interviewed him at least once. And I'm a huge fan of his work. I very much like the body keeps the score. And
yes.
So you talk about that, your body, a quotation from him, your body, believe it or not, remembers everything: sound, smells, touches, tastes, but the memory is not held in your mind, locked somewhere in the recesses of your brain. Instead, it's held in your body, all the way down at the cellular level. And the idea of your idea of body armor, taking that a bit further, sounds like it's a kind of a way in which sort of trauma can freeze the body into certain sort of movement restrictions. Could you explain that?
Well, it is not clear how this happens. There are certain traumas, certain, really really upsetting, life-endangering situations, which have a tremendous effect on the whole body. I mean, I'm sure that some of your listeners, for example, are familiar with the fact that sometimes during wartime, let's say in London during the Blitz, some people's hair suddenly overnight went from black to gray, right?
Yeah.
Some people will have huge sort of physical changes under stress. And that would be one of the more visible ones, right? When your hair, overnight or within a few hours turns gray, or some people will lose all their hair. Other people will, of course, develop high blood pressure, diabetes, all kinds of other things can happen as a result of fear or trauma, anxiety, depression, all of those things. Now, one way in which the body defends against that kind of onslaught from the environment is by developing body armor. And by that we mean a kind of drawing in of all your cells and tissues, and trying to create an impermeable membrane around yourself, so to speak. Sometimes this is over the whole body. Sometimes it is only in one part of the body. If it is in one part of the body, that's where body work can really help. Body work, in other words, certain forms of massage.
Would Moshe Feldenkrais work with Nora
yes.
in this category?
Yes, Feldenkrais definitely would fall into that. Rolfing would fall into that. Many other sort of more focused types of body work. I don't want to use the word massage because although it is a form of massage, but massage creates in people's minds a more relaxing type of body work, whereas this would be more focused, so that you would really be pushing in, let's say, with both thumbs or sometimes even with elbows on an area which feels constricted, okay? Tight, because you don't want to let anything in, right? So it's a kind of self protective device.
This makes me think of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. It's because it sounds like a carapace. It sounds like the sort of like insect's carapace going around the person.
Yes. Have you ever been to Prague?
I have been to Prague only once. It was just beautiful, and very good food as well.
Very good food and very nice people.
Oh,
very very nice people. I was in Prague when was I in Prague? Last year. And I had a wonderful time. But the reason that I mention it, of course, is because Franz Kafka is very much celebrated in Prague. And certainly Metamorphosis is an incredible story. And so is the one where a person turns into a bug.
That's the bug. That's the Metamorphosis one, isn't it?
Is that Metamorphosis?
Yeah,
okay.
That's the one I was thinking of. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there are all those short stories, and I guess the name of the book is Metamorphosis, perhaps. But there's also one short story about a person being sort of tortured and going through some kind of a machine that inscribes things on his skin.
Oh no, I haven't read that one.
Oh yeah, that's very famous. That's another one. That's much more terrifying. So it's some kind of a machine that inscribes, sort of tattoos things into his skin as a punishment.
That is interesting. It does seem as if he's intuiting towards exactly the sort of work that you're talking about here.
Yes. Well, a lot of writers have had incredible psychological insights, like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, people like that. So anyway, going back to quantum mechanics, so there's much, I think, that we can learn from quantum mechanics, and it's it's the science of the future, because, like, for example, now a lot of scientists are working on quantum computers and trying to apply quantum mechanics to computing. And another way that that people are working on new ways of computing is through biological computers, using DNA as a memory container, which of course it can, because DNA contains like millions and millions of pieces of information. So
yes, you talk about how you mentioned how some scientists had programmed into strands of DNA things like the certain songs. How does that happen? How did they? I couldn't understand how that was happening.
Yeah, I think one person was able to put into DNA the complete works of Shakespeare.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know how that is done. I really don't know. But I know that, has been reported. And again, it's the science of the future. And the reason I mention it in my book is because it shows you how much information you can actually store in a cell, which is so small that you can't see it with the naked eye. And so people thought, well, how could you store any kind of information in something that you can't even see? But you can. I mean, it's amazing, but it's true.
I was listening to someone the other day, and I can't remember the name of he's an evolutionary biologist, and he said that, he firmly believes that black bacteria, for example, have a form of, whether you call it a proto consciousness or a slight amount of consciousness, but that and whether one is a sort of panpsychist and believes that that sort of everything does, or whether there's within a complexity of system, or how it works, I think is probably less important to me anyway, than the acceptance that we're in an animate world, and an animate world from such a from the microscopic level, and that and the idea that you talk about with all these connections and communications, that draws me into the feeling of whether we take it from the level of a cell, or an organ, or a human being, or a culture, or a ecosystem, that all of these things are entities whose essence is relationship, connectivity, and communication. And whatever fractal layer you choose to focus upon, you've got the same thing going on. You've got the same level of there being an intelligence, there being communication to a sort of a more greater complexity or lesser complexity, and that everything is in flux with the way in which the environment is at a given time. And of course then everything else is also interacting and changing the environment. So there is this complete polyphonic dance of consciousnesses, of beings, of life. And it makes the world that much more exciting than I think a kind of reductive idea does.
Exactly. Speaking of reductionism, now Chat GPT, AI, artificial intelligence, is having its moment now. Everybody is talking about that. So I was reading about this Joshua Bongard, professor of computer science at the University of Vermont, and he believes that consciousness doesn't just consist of cognition and mental activity, but has an essentially bodily aspect.
Yes.
I thought that was really, really, really very interesting. I'm sorry about this telephone. Excuse me. Hello? It's a fax machine that is trying to get in touch. And he has if I can tell you about that, he has
Yeah.
developed beings called xenobots, made entirely of frog cells, linked together so that a programmer can control them like machines. According to Dr. Bongard, it's not just humans and animals that have evolved to adapt to their surroundings and interact with each other. Our tissues have evolved to subserve these functions, and our cells have evolved to subserve our tissues. And this is a quote from him. What we are is intelligence machines made of intelligence machines made of intelligence machines all the way down, he said.
Wow.
So, you know, so that's another way of looking at what I have been saying, which is saying that cells, you know, you go from the brain to tissues to cells, and cells also have their own intelligence, but especially when they work together as networks, which is what computers do. When you can connect more and more computers to each other, you can do incredible things. And it's the same thing with our bodies. It's all, as long as we are connected to our cells, we can stay intelligent.
What would you like to see growing out of your work? What kind of research, what kind of developments, what kind of ways of increasing flourishing at whatever level do you hope might come from the work that you've been doing here?
Well, first of all, scientific emphasis on the brain is all wrong. It does not serve us well. Scientific emphasis on the brain has started, you know, in the Western culture with Greek civilization, which has been patriarchal, and patriarchal gives rise to hierarchical social structures. And so everything, you know, who is the head of the government, who is at the head of this group, how do we get ahead in life? All of that is head. And so I'm really sorry about this.
It's a determined factor.
It's a determined factor, yes. So everything is head. And we have to realize that we have to change that. It does, you know, like chickens have their pecking order, but this system does not serve humanity well. So we have to change the hierarchical structure, first of all, and that means treating all people equally, of course, socially, so that, you know, it's not just, you know, white civilization, which is up here and every other color is down there, but it's the same thing in social interactions. But more, well, I don't know whether it's more important, but equally important, let's say, is that, for example, in medicine, because of this hierarchical way of looking at the world, people who are cardiologists only look at the heart. People who are urologists will only look at the kidneys and the bladder, etc., etc., etc. What we need is for them all, like, to come together, to work together, just like the brain has to work with the rest of the body. People who are separated by these different scientific disciples need to work much more together. So we need to create institutions, whether it's hospitals or universities, where people with different specialties have an opportunity to meet with each other, let's say once a month, and have an exchange of opinions and theories, and can discuss things, so that the cardiologist can speak to a neurologist, and they will discover that certain things they have in common, and how can they work together on some of the problems, like Alzheimer's, for example. Okay, so like there's a university in Australia, I think it's called Curtin University in Australia, where they have discovered that, the plaques, that the amyloid plaques that seem to be responsible at the moment, that's what is being said, but I'm sure there's much more to it than that. But amyloid plaques are sort of the villains at the moment of Alzheimer's disease. So all the research, medical, pharmacological, goes towards how can we prevent the laying down of amyloid plaques in the brain. But at the Australian University, and it's not the first one, but it's the one that I know about, have discovered that amyloid plaques are actually made in the liver. And it's from the liver that they are being transferred to the brain. So if we could prevent amyloid plaques, to be manufactured in the liver, because it's probably because there's something wrong with the liver that is producing amyloid plaques, because the liver is not made for that purpose. Boy, these people just don't give up. And secondly, even if you can't prevent the formation of amyloid plaques, how do you prevent it from going to the brain? Then we
how
could
does it get through the brain-body barrier?
Yeah, that's right. It does. It does. I don't know. It does. You're quite right. There is this barrier in the brain, but it gets through. It gets through somehow. It's a good question, but it gets through. And we can go on and on about these things. For example, antidepressants.
Yes.
They work in some people, they don't work in others.
Yes, yes.
In 1/3 of the people, they really work. In 1/3 of the people, they make no difference. And 1/3 of the people have to stop taking it because of side effects. Now, it has been discovered that there are bacteria in the gut of many people who actually destroy antidepressants. And so the reason that certain antidepressants don't work in certain people is because of the bacteria contained in their gut, gastrointestinal tract, GI tract, right? The same thing applies to many other medications. One of the most frequently used medications is statins, which prevent you from developing from developing
atherosclerosis, or is it something like that?
It's cholesterol. It's anti-cholesterol, right? So in order so that you don't develop plaques in your arteries, right? So if we had, before prescribing, let's say, statins or antidepressants or many other drugs, if we had a way of sort of examining a person's gut bacteria, then we would know what kind of medications will work and what kind of medications will not work. But you have to pay attention to the gut bacteria instead of just, oh, you're depressed or you have high blood glucose, so we'll give you simvastatin. That's the wrong way.
Isn't there some suggestion that particular gut bacteria can influence the mood anyway? So aside from what they're doing, and you do talk about this in the book, that aside from what they do with the antidepressants, they're already interacting with the mood of the individual.
They're incredibly important. Lack of serotonin is blamed for many people developing depression, that they don't have enough serotonin in their brains. Once again, in their brains, they don't have enough serotonin. So what you do is you give them Prozac or any one of those drugs, and they increase the serotonin content of the brain because it does not get absorbed so quickly. Okay, but most of the serotonin in our bodies is actually produced in the gut. It's cells in the lining of the gut that produce serotonin. So if you want to have more serotonin, that's where we should be looking at, instead of, how to prevent the reabsorption by neurons in the brain. So like we are looking at the wrong places in terms of pharmaceuticals and the production of medicines, because we are so focused on the brain, like all our moods, all our anxieties, all our feelings, it's all in the brain. And that is wrong. It's not true. It's just not true.
No, I think I remember that the serotonin in the stomach thing, which I
Yes.
learnt from a yoga practitioner who was actually doing some research with, I think, Newcastle University, because
Uh-huh.
of the they were researching sort of somatic interaction, somatic influences on mood and so forth. So you know, it's not completely the same as what's her name, Cuddy's power pose thing, but it certainly does. I mean,
Yes.
there are sort of, you know, however subtle, but mood differences to posture and to holding yourself, and breathing. I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Oh, breathing. Yes, we haven't even talked about breathing. I mean, this is something that yoga practitioners have been teaching us for, I don't know, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, whatever
yeah.
it is. How important, deep breathing can be, and how that can affect the rest of your body, including your moods, the way your
Mm.
mind works, all that kind of stuff, learning to relax, learning to breathe, which is all bodily stuff, right? Has really
You know,
nothing to do with the brain. It's how you breathe and how that affects your body and your mind. And
I have sorry to interrupt.
oh, no, 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 go ahead.
Um, I have a sort of breathing exercise, which is a kind of, you know, a sort of combined with my own personal environmental prayer thing that I do outside in the morning when I'm feeding the birds.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's, you know, it involves Mother Earth and Father Sky and, you know, connection, and is basically what's called the box breathing, where you inhale, hold, exhale, hold, and go around in that cycle. And I find that after I've done a few rounds of this breathing, the you know, the squirrels and birds in my garden feel happier about being close to me. I'm no longer got the same sort of, like, you know, spiky, rigid, predatory energy. Now, I'm not suggesting that, you know, I don't know, but I don't think I'm giving up. It's so much about energy as about them being able to read the body state of something that looks relaxed, as opposed to something that looks sort of
Mm.
tense and jittery and unpredictable. And the fact that, you know, animals who you can't persuade verbally, you can't con them with your concept, they're just responding to the situation as it is. And I've noticed this for a long time. When I used to do Tai Chi, and I had horses, and when I did Tai Chi around the horses would always go to sleep. I'd have, you know, foxes and magpies perching around me. I mean, it was like sort of like Snow White in the woods. And I think there was just something about this sort of body that was at peace, that seemed to offer something um of sanctuary to other creatures.
And speaking of other creatures, I mean, some of them are incredibly intuitive. Like, I've heard of dogs, for example, who will, let's say, in a home for the elderly, they will go over to the person who is in most pain or who is most upset, and just snuggle up against them to make them feel better.
Mm.
And also, of course, dogs are very good at sniffing out cancer.
Yeah.
When a person has no idea, when no doctor has found any cancer on them, the dog will identify cancer in a person who has not yet been diagnosed with cancer, and then later they are diagnosed as having it. So, I mean, animals have incredible powers that we don't even know about at the moment.
It,
And one of the things that surprised me as I was researching my book was that some animals that don't even have brains, like octopuses, for example, who don't have brains, are incredibly smart and sensitive, and molds, which I think don't even have many neurons, are able to learn how to run through mazes. And it's just a one cell being, it's just one very large cell, a mold, very, very primitive, as primitive a being as you can get. And yet, they learn how to run through mazes, find the shortest distance between, where they start and where there's food, things like that. So, once again, there's just so much that we don't know about how our bodies and bodies in general, tissues, cells work, except one thing is very clear, that these cells are much more complicated, much more complex than we have ever thought of them as being. Yeah.
And I'm so sorry I interrupted you when you were in the middle of talking about breathing, and I didn't know if you wanted to sort of finish up that idea before you were rudely interrupted by me getting overexcited.
Not at all, not rudely at all. No. I think, breathing is very, very interesting. And again, breathing shows how you can affect your mind, how, people who breathe in a certain way can get rid of depression or start feeling better. I mean, there's just so much to it that I've just scratched the surface, really. I mean, there's much more work to be done. But what is really important is to develop your faculty of interoception, which means like being in touch with the interior of your body. So there's perception, which is outside, and interoception, which is being aware of what's going on inside.
Yeah.
There are so many people who never pay any attention to signals from their body, like hunger, for example. There are some people who never feel hungry.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that.
No, neither can I. Neither can I. Yeah. Especially if there's chocolate in sight. It's one of my weaknesses: fresh bread and chocolate. Those are the
yeah, fresh bread, definitely.
Fresh bread, the smell of it. Yeah. So I would definitely champion that. I would definitely advocate people becoming, more aware of their bodies, what's going on outside on the skin, what's going on inside. So much of our attention is focused on the outside, how we look, how other people look, what other people will think of our looks, all that kind of stuff, instead of much more being focused what's going on inside of me. What messages am I getting from my hips or my knees or from my lungs, all that kind of stuff. So I would definitely want to leave your listeners with that message that, looking inside, not only psychologically in terms of, unconscious messages that I have inherited from my parents or acquired from my teachers. Like I had a teacher, I think I was about 7 years old, and there was a choir. I was supposed to be in a choir, and we were supposed to sing. And she came over to me and she said, "Don't sing, just open your mouth." Because you have no, what is that called when you don't have,
you're tone deaf, or
you're tone deaf, don't sing. That was the last time I did any singing. I totally lost interest in music. It finished me for 20 or 30 years in terms of any interest in music or singing. Like, when other people sing the national anthem or something like that, I would just, open my mouth, but I wouldn't sing because I was told that I shouldn't sing.
That's
So,
horrible.
I mean, people don't realize that a totally stupid comment, like a, just a thoughtless comment, can really have long-term effects on a person.
Mm.
And so again, it's important to keep sometimes your mouth shut before you make a stupid comment, because it can hurt someone for a long time, sometimes forever.
Well, we've really only scratched the surface of your book, which, although it isn't incredibly long, is just so incredibly rich and detailed that
Yes.
there is far more in there for those who are interested to explore. And I don't know if there's anything that you'd particularly like to stress now, because I'm mindful that I've taken up quite a lot of your time today.
Thank you. That is very, very kind of you. Well, no, I think we have covered a lot. I think the important thing to remember is that perhaps in terms of epigenetics, epigenetics has given us the tools to really control our lives to a great extent, more than we have ever been able to. To know that if I speak to someone who's very critical of me, it's going to have one effect on my genes right then and there. But if I speak to someone who is loving and positive, it will have another, mostly beneficial effect on how my whole body operates. Like everything is constantly, as you said, in a state of flux. And so nothing is written in stone. Everything can be changed, and you have the power to make those changes. And also you have the power to make those changes if you're pregnant. If you're a pregnant woman, you can have a great deal of influence on the baby's somatic and psychological health by the way you live, by the way you think, the kinds of things you say to the baby while it's still in the womb or after it's born. Like all those things give us new powers that we did not have before. And so use them, for God's sake, use them.
Thank you. That's a wonderful place to end. Dr. Thomas Verny, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. And let's do it. Let's do this sometime again. And it was a pleasure. Thank you.